So I have previously mentioned that I moved to Turkey planning on actually immigrating there, actually becoming a Turkish citizen, and I got deported. And so I said I would tell that story, and so I'm going to tell that story now. So basically what happened, so I get to Turkey. I had taught English in Korea, and then after Korea, I had wanted to go to Turkey. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to fly to Turkey. I have money saved. I'm going to try to find a job there. And I went around to Istanbul, and basically all the people in Istanbul were like, yeah, we aren't going to do a work permit, but don't worry, like the government doesn't care if you have a work permit as a foreigner teaching English. But I still didn't want to do that. So I went out to Izmir, fell in love with Izmir. Again, same thing. Then I traveled around the country more, spent a lot of time in Adana, which I wrote a story on my blog about an experience with a laughing dove in the Adana Starbucks. But I got a job in Gaziantep, which is near Adana. In Gaziantep, I would call it Turkey's Phoenix because it's hot, dry, sprawling, ugly, and full of people who are constantly complaining about the people from south of the border, because the Syrian civil war was going on. And so most of the Syrian refugees were in Kilis, which is south of Gaziantep, but there were a few who were in Gaziantep, and the rent in Gaziantep was some of the most expensive in the country, which the locals were blaming on the Syrians who had come as refugees. And so I got a job with this company, the Wall Street Institute, that were supposed to get me a work permit. And so there was going to be a week of training, which became longer because of Ramadan holiday, Bayram intervened. And I thought, okay, they're going to apply for the work permit, and I should have it by about the time I start working. And then 4.5 months later, they tell me, hey, we're going to apply for your work permit now. Can you give us these documents? And I'm like, I basically hit the ceiling because I had been asking my boss, hey, what's up with this work permit? And she kept telling me, oh, you know how Turkish bureaucracy is, which I do. I did not do whatever you're supposed to do with a SIM card if you're going to be in Turkey for more than 30 days, within 30 days. And so getting that resolved after 30 days in Istanbul, I spent most of a day going between 2 different buildings to actually get that resolved. So I'm like, yeah, Turkish bureaucracy can be a headache, and I assumed she meant it was the government bureaucracy, but no, she was implying to me that it was the government when it was actually probably justifying it to herself as, oh, it's our people are just holding off on doing this for 4.5 months. And there had been a job listing in Antioch, which was better than the one I had, did get a work permit, and I thought about applying. I'm like, well, they've already applying for work permit on my behalf, so I don't want to, if I'd known they were doing this, I mean, I wouldn't have worked for them to begin with, but I didn't know until I was 4.5 months in that this was what had happened. And then then my mother and brother were visiting. So this was right before I was going to take some time to go to Istanbul and Izmir and spend time with my mother and brother. And so I'm like, okay, I'm mad at them, but I have 2 more weeks. And then when I come back, I should have the work permit. And so I got the work permit in I forget exactly when, but it wasn't in my book yet. And then so I read an article in the news somewhere talking about how the government of Gaziantep, the immigration authorities, had just finished with the temporary work permits for all of the Syrian refugees in Gaziantep. And so then it was like a day, maybe 2 days after that, they came to where I was working, and they interviewed and looked for documentation. I had a residence permit, but my work permit was not in my book yet. And my coworker didn't have either of those. She was in the process of applying for her residence permit, which you need to get a work permit. I'd got my residency permit on my own before I was hired. And so then my boss was not worried, and they said, there's going to be an interview, it's going to be fine. Just tell them that this was training. And I'm like, it was not training. And like, I was thinking you were doing it when I was actually doing the training. But I was also, they put me in a situation where I had to do that. And they asked more questions, which they did not prep us for. And then, like a week after that, I got a call that said, hey, the immigration people, they're here at the school, they're looking for you, they're going to send a bus to pick you up in about an hour, so pack up what you can, and we will... Oh, another thing my boss lied to me about is, so they applied for the work permit in Izmir, which is where I'd wanted to work, and she told me there were no vacancies, and when I went to Izmir to get my work permit, I talked to people there, and there had been a vacancy the whole time from before she hired me till then. So I could have been in Izmir. She just knew I liked Turkey enough that she could make me do Gaziantep by lying to me. So I was really angry about that, and I asked her, and she's like, well, no, Izmir is full now, which I don't know if that was true, but we'll bring you to Izmit, which is a town near Istanbul. It's smaller. I haven't been there. I don't know how it was, but it still sounded better than Gaziantep. And I'm like, yeah, okay. And she was also like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. Like, the bosses, the owner's connections, he's never seen anything like this, but they'll get it sorted out. And I was like, well, if they don't, so they took us, I should mention, they took us to a place we were like, they did fingerprinting and some interviews and had people interview us to make sure we weren't beaten or anything. And then they brought us to this detention center. And so the Syrians were in camps, but this detention center was for people who were not Arab, or at least not Syrian. And the only other person besides me and my coworker was an Azeri woman who, if you don't know Turkey and Azerbaijan, it's kind of like US-Canadian relations, maybe closer. And so she was there, and my coworker had to deal with that, but I was alone in this room, and they wouldn't let me have anything electronic, including my e-reader, and I didn't have any physical books, so that was kind of frustrating, and I did a lot of sleeping and a lot of thinking, because there wasn't really anything else I could do, and that's another disadvantage of having e-readers. And certainly, like in a foreign country where nobody speaks English, it's easier to have an e-reader than physical books. And so then my boss is like, yeah, we will, like, he's going to get it worked out and we'll get it sorted out and we'll bring you back. And I was like, okay, well, you lied to me about Izmir. Well, first of all, like, you need to get us, if they don't get it sorted out, they will pay for us to be deported. Like, they will pay to deport us after 2 weeks in this place. I am not waiting 2 weeks. This is your fault. So if they're not going to actually, like, overturn this, you should be paying for us to be deported, because then we'll be sooner. And then the second thing is, I know that there was an opening in Izmir, so I want to be in Izmir. And she's like, well, no, we don't have Izmir, but we'll give you Izmit. And of course she didn't do that. They almost didn't pay my remaining salary. And there was a story there where one of my coworkers reached out, asked how I was doing. And the way he did it, I got the feeling, I was like, I think, like, they're putting him up to this. And so because he was in my training and I hadn't heard from him since. And so I told him that I hadn't gotten my salary and that I was writing an article that I thought I could get published, because people who had gotten published in places like The Atlantic or National Geographic told me, yeah, this is something they might publish. And I was debating whether to actually name the company, which, as I said, I have decided now in hindsight to do. But at the time, I was not in a great place, and I finished writing it. I don't know if I still have it somewhere or not, but I didn't actually get around to figuring out who to do it. But they did end up paying me the remainder of my salary, but they also did not bring me back, which I think might have been, and I think this was a big part, was that it was, again, I was the one being like, okay, well, if they don't deport us, you need to deport us. I was the one pressing on, hey, like, I know there's an opening in Izmir. And my coworker, I think they just sent back to Gaziantep, I'm not sure. But they didn't bring me back. So anyways, while I was in the detention center, they were, like, it was not nearly as bad as it could have been. The worst thing was just that you needed to knock to be let out to the bathroom, and you weren't allowed any electronics, so I didn't have anything to read. But aside from that, it was fine. And then the American embassy came, and I should mention, both at the deportation interview and at the center, I believe it was, they offered us tea. Like, that just, everywhere in Turkey, even when you're being deported, they offer you tea. And then the embassy sent someone from Adana, the consulate, and she told me, like, she had never seen this before. Like, it was true what they told me in Istanbul, that generally they don't care if you're working illegally at the time. And even if they did, she said, the policy was always, if you've even applied for a work permit, they will wait to see what happens before deporting you, when they do deport people, which was rare. Whereas I had actually had it granted, but it was granted for the wrong city and not yet in my book at the time that they came in and did this raid. And now they were trying to repeal it, and she said she had never seen anything like that, never seen them repealing when it was already actually granted. And they seemed really annoyed about the fact that it was in the wrong city where the owner had connections, so I think that might have been it. They also accused me and my coworker of being missionaries, which at the time, both of us were agnostics, so that was funny, but I wonder if it was they thought we were journalists, because we had a bunch of Syrian refugees who had taught English at, like, the college level coming in and asking, hey, can we teach here? And the policy was native speakers and Turks only. And so they couldn't, even though they were obviously more credentialed than I was. Although linguistic background, I knew at least as much about English as they do, even though it's often foreign speakers who know more about a language, like grammar and stuff, I was an exception there. But anyways, and then we also had a journalist from New Zealand come in as well. So I don't know, maybe they thought we were journalists, but afterwards I learned there were missionaries in that part of Turkey. So maybe they did think we were missionaries. Maybe they also just were bored because they had processed all these visas. I don't know exactly what the reasoning. I mean, obviously I was working illegally. I thought I was doing basically working as legally as I could, right? Because I thought they were doing a permit that they applied while I was in training, and I should get it soon after starting working, which was better than working without a permit. But still, I was in violation of Turkish work and immigration law. So they had the pretext, but that doesn't give the reason. And there's a number of things I've wondered about. And again, I think either they really thought we were missionaries, or they thought we were journalists, or they were just bored. So I think it was probably one of those three things. But it also sounds like there had been a change in policy, and I wonder, because this was around the time that Erdogan was starting to go down against the Gulen movement, and I wonder if the owner of the company was connected in some way with the Gulenists, and this was sort of getting back at him. But anyways, another interesting thing is, so one of the people at the deportation center was complaining about, like, he's like, yeah, you'd be treated worse getting deported from the US, and I'm like, yeah, I know. And then he was also like, and also, it's harder to get into the US. Like, as a Turkish citizen, it's very hard for me to visit the US. But fortunately, I have a service passport, and I can go there as a tourist on my service passport. I'm like, so you are deporting me for a minor violation of immigration law that I wasn't really in control of, while bragging to me about deliberately violating US immigration law and abusing a service passport. So that was interesting. But anyway, after the embassy visited, they allowed us to hang out in the common area a lot more, me and my coworker, instead of being in the segregated, like, holding facilities. And they also, with our money, but still, they got us food from local places. And so then we were brought to the airport. A guy escorted us. I think when we were in the airport, I got my e-reader back, and certainly I got everything back, all my electronics, after we were through security. And I was actually allowed to keep my residency book, I believe, and I was looking for it, but it's in my jacket, and I don't know where my old jacket is. Anyways, and so then I would have been banned for Turkey for 5 years, but they did pay the fine that made it only 1 year. And if they got a visa for me to come back and work legally, then it would have been less than that. And they did that for my coworker, not me, as I said. And so then, flight back, Turkish Airlines food was better than most Turkish restaurants in the US that I've had. And then, so I flew instead of getting a flight back home, I flew into JFK and then took the train from JFK to Springfield, and had my mother pick me up in Springfield, because that was much more pleasant than trying to catch a connection at JFK to Hartford. So as I was editing this video, I realized there was something I wanted to clarify and something I forgot to mention. So just to clarify quickly, I realized the way I was talking about Gaziantep, I don't like the city, but the people there were great. The people were at least as friendly and hospitable as people elsewhere in Turkey. As a city, I did not like it for a number of reasons. And then the thing that I forgot to mention is, so then when I got back to JFK Airport, the guy interviewing me at immigrations was obviously first-generation Asian immigrant, didn't speak great English, and he looked at my passport and he said, "Your hair is red in your passport photo." And I said, "Yeah, it does kind of look reddish," because when I was younger, so my mother's a redhead, my brother's a redhead. I am not a redhead and never have been, although I have the redheaded, my skin will not tan, I can only burn, and I have the redhead anesthesia tolerance. But I've never had red hair. However, if it's wet or under certain lights, when I was younger, my hair would look reddish. And so my passport photo, which was taken under fluorescent lights at like a CVS or something, my hair did look kind of auburn. And then he said, "Your hair is red in this picture. Your hair is not red." And so he then sent me into the waiting interrogation room. And something I realized is I don't think there was anyone like watching to make sure I went there. I could have just walked out. And certainly I could have walked out probably, and no one would have stopped me without talking to someone. But I waited there an hour, and then a black woman interviewed me, looked at my passport, looked at the notes that he'd made, or maybe they took my passport, maybe that's why, I forget. But anyways, so I waited there an hour, and then this black woman, she took one look and was like, "Yeah, you're obviously the same person in your photo," and I was free to go to New York. But I had to wait for an hour because this guy at customs could not believe that my hair looked a different color from the hair in my passport photo. So that was fun, but I had my e-reader, so I was able to read at least at the time, although in fluorescent lights, which I don't like. But so that wasn't that bad, just added an hour to my travel time because of this issue with my magic color-changing hair, apparently. Anyways, so my plan had been, like, I was going to teach English until I became a Turkish citizen, and then I was going to try to found a, like, tourism company, because I have an interest in, like, a knowledge that... A lot of tourist companies are sort of focused on, hey, here's a local with local knowledge, but I'm in sort of a weird place of I'm, like, an outsider, but I, like, have an interest in Turkey, and so I have a sense of these might be the things that might interest people that both the regular American companies that focused on the main tourist sites and Turks focusing on what's interesting to Turks might not pick up on. And the reason I'd wanted to live abroad and move abroad is, as an autistic person, I've always noticed it's a lot easier being a foreigner than it is trying to pass as a person in the neurotypical world in your own country. And obviously I'm in the US and I'm staying now, but that was my plan. I was obsessed with Turkey since high school. But yeah, and it ended up not working out. And then right after were the Gezi Park protests that really... After that, for quite a while, Turkey was, like... Erdogan was doing things, constantly messing with the Turkish economy, but it kept growing in spite of Erdogan. So I don't know if I would have ended up leaving Turkey. Like, the whole time I was living there, my mother was sending me messages, like, whenever there was a terrorist attack, like, are you okay? And I'd be like, Mom, this is nowhere near me, and the murder rate in Turkey is a fraction of what it is in the US. And it's funny, because when I was in Korea, like, all my Korean students were convinced that if they went to the United States for a week, they would be murdered, which we have, obviously, a higher homicide rate in the US than in Korea, but it's not, like, dramatically higher. So, anyways, yeah, so I don't know exactly what the underlying, like, ultimate reason for this was. As the embassy said, it was a very drastic change in policy compared to what they'd seen. It could have been a number of things. Again, they could have really thought we were missionaries. They could have thought we were journalists. They could have just been these officials wanting to show their power and being bored now that they had time on their hands, and being annoyed about the fact that my employer did the work permit in Izmir, which actually I think the reason they did that was, no, because they did it for my coworker. I was going to say, because I got my residence permit in Izmir, but they were also making my coworker apply in Izmir, even though she did not have a residence book, so no. And it also could have been that the Erdogan government was trying to make an example of Gulenist business owners, and possibly the owner of this company was a Gulenist. So, don't know what it was. Ended up back in the US, and that threw a wrench in my plans, and then I ended up unemployed for like 2 years, and then I went to grad school, and then didn't finish my PhD program, and was unemployed for another couple of years. And I don't know what my life would have been like if I made it work in Turkey or not, but one thing is how things are. Obviously, it didn't ultimately, like, set me back forever. And it's an interesting experience. And I knew at the time this is going to be an interesting story to tell. And so as I said, I was trying to write up an article and going to publish it. And then once I'd written it, I fell into a depression and didn't actually figure out, hey, can I actually sell this to anyone? And then I didn't do anything with that until now, when it's obviously been in the news about, obviously there's been changes in U.S. immigration policy. And I'm like, it's obviously, this is something populist governments seem to do. And I got caught up in that. And again, for me, it was not scary. It was more like, not too many people can have a story about being deported to the US. I also did think I was likely to actually come back. I believed them when they told me, which I really shouldn't have, given that they lied to me about applying for the permit, and they lied to me about there being no vacancies in Izmir. I really shouldn't have believed her when she said that she was going to bring me back. But I did. And so I was amused. I was singing Neil Diamond, Coming to America, and Chuck Berry, Back in the USSA, and some other songs of that nature when I had nothing to read. And actually, after the interview, but before I was deported, my employers were still convinced that I was not going to be deported, and I was trusting them on this. But I also was worried about it enough that I wrote a song called The Repatriation Blues, which I wrote about a guy who immigrates, American who immigrates to Mexico and gets deported. Similar situation in Mexico, because I thought, as an American, getting deported from Mexico to the US is much funnier than getting deported from Turkey to the US. And I will see if I can find the lyrics to that song, and I think I emailed them to my mother, and if I did, I will share them in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.